Erik Brönsson. Ja.
Kalli er alltaf það. Kalli. Já, við erum alltaf bara að geta þess að séu allir á hleyptur inn. Það eru margar. Takk, Kristinn. Það er komin sír. Jæja, gott fólk, við ætlum að byrja fundinn. Endilega fá það sæti. Allir sem eru mættir. Það er kaffi og meðlæti og alles hérna frammi, þannig að endilega bara fáðu ykkur og fundi samtíð. Við fórum náðu ykkur í og svolítið aftur, ekki mál. Herðu, það byrjaði á íslensku. I'm gonna start in Icelandic, Kevin, just to explain a few things. Góðan daginn, verið velkomin öll sömul á þennan 8. fund hjá okkur í Sjósvíkstaflokki Íslands í dag. Nú þegar eru svona rétt 2 vikur í þjóðaratkvæðagreiðslu áframhald viðræðna við Evrópusambandið. Bara stuttlega ætla ég að segja að við sósíalistar erum afdráttarlaus í okkar stefnu í þessu máli. Við teljum Evrópusambandið og aðild að því ekki þjóna hagsmunum almennings á Íslandi. Evrópusambandið byggir á einni forsendu umfram allt annað, sameiginlegum markaði. Sameiginlegum markaði sem lýtur stjórn ógnastórs og ólýðræðislegs skrifræðis og báknis. Þannig reynir Evrópusambandið að formfesta kapítalismann með mjög hörmulegum árangri. Það í mörg horn að líta þegar við kemur þessari ákvörðun, en það Evrópusambandið ógnar flókið apparat. Að okkar mati því best að ræða málin og hlusta á fólk með einstaka innsýn ákveðna kima þessa stóra hagsmunamáls og af þeim sökum þá ákveðum við að bjóða Karen Sunds til landsins. Þau flytja fyrir okkur erindi reynslu Dana af veru í ESB út frá hennar sviði. Nú skipti ég yfir í ensku. There are copies of Karen's lecture or speech. I'm going to pass them around, so by all means, take a copy if you would like to have a written copy in your hands.
It's only limited amount. Due to paper.
Not an infinite amount, but if you are interested, absolutely do so. Right, so Karen.
Yes.
Karen Sunds is 67 years old, lives in Jutland. She has been politically active from a very young age and has been a very active participant in the resistance against the EU inside of Denmark, including the referendum in Denmark about the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. She spent quite a lot of time in the leadership of the People's Movement Against the EU inside Denmark, and worked widely within the labor movement in Denmark, including campaigning against EU attempts to formalize minimum wages. She's also very active in the struggle against US military bases in Denmark and sits on the board of the Danish Communist Party. Karen is educated on economics and has, for most of her life, worked in agriculture and gardening. And she is here today to discuss her vision of and her experience of Denmark in the European Union and what she considers important for Iceland to keep in mind now when the referendum is approaching. Welcome, Karen, and thank you for coming.
Yeah. You hear me?
Yep.
Yes, fine. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm grateful to be here. And I wish I could help this presentation in Icelandic, because that's what you understand. To be honest, the only thing I'm very good in is Danish. But I have promised to make this presentation in English. As Jon said, there is a paper, and there's more written in this paper than I will say here, because I think that's the best way to do it. I will not try to be an expert on Icelandic affairs. You know far more about that than I do. So I would like to talk about what we in Denmark have experienced during our 54 years as member of the Union. I understand that you have never held a referendum on the EU here in Iceland. There was no referendum when you joined the EEA agreement, even though this move clearly involved a transfer of sovereignty. That's quite remarkable. In Denmark, we've been voted on the Union 9 times. So you can probably see that the Union has always been a central part of the political agenda in Denmark. We have learned in a hard way what the Union is really about. The vast majority of Danes have never wanted to be a part of European political union. When we voted on membership in 1972, we were promised that the EEC would never interfere in national politics and certainly not in social and labor politics. It was all about pork prices and for the sake of everyday household needs, as they put it. Denmark was an agricultural nation, so price guarantees and the golden age for farming were promised. But we were soon to learn better. In 1986, we voted on membership of the single market. Once again, we were promised that it's only about economy, they said. Prime Minister Poul Schlüter declared, the union is stone dead. Nothing could be more decideful. In single market, the free movement of goods, capital, service and labor is sacrosanct. Any attempt to maintain specific standards for environment, health, food equality and so on is an example of interfering with market forces. This will often lead to legal proceedings because of technical barriers to trade, as it is called. Whether we are talking about childcare, hospital operations, drinking water, pension schemes or banana, no restrictions must be placed on the market. It is union legislation that allows that public subsidies for medical treatment to be taken to private hospitals abroad. Such a policy naturally has far-reaching consequences for the public sector in Denmark. It is also union legislation that dictates that public hospitals and educational institutions must compete with one another to attract customers. However, the principle of the free movement of labor also has very significant implications to social benefit. All European workers must, in principle, have access to Danish welfare benefits. That's what the union legislation says. This was the direct reason why the Danish public early retirement scheme was converted into a private insurance scheme, because otherwise, under union legislation, it would have had to be accessible to all migrant workers. But we realized all this much too late, and the monopolists got their green light for the single market. It was the European Roundtable for Industry, ERT, which is the largest lobby organization for European monopolists, that drew up the entire roadmap for the implementation of the single market. After that, the monopolists demanded a political framework to match their economic power. The result of this was the Maastricht Treaty, on which the Danes were to vote in the summer of 1992. The Maastricht Treaty makes the entire roadmap for the establishment of the Economic and Monetary Union. Once again, this roadmap was drawn up by the ERT. And as Jacques Delors, then President of the European Commission, openly declared in 1993, the Economic and Monetary Union is the launch pad for political union. But it is also the Maastricht Treaty that contains the first ever mention of social and labor policy. In other words, here we have a treaty that contains of all the elements for a fully fledged political and economic union. The Yes parties, which was led by the Social Democrats, nevertheless felt confident that they could make a yes to the referendum. To be honest, those of us who were active in the No campaign hadn't really believed either that we could defeat big business and the entire political power. But on the 2nd of June, the Danes voted no to the Maastricht. Those were fantastic days, but we hadn't prepared ourselves for the fact that we would also have to defend our victory. We were so naive. We believed that they would respect our referendum, which was, after all, a veto. With the Danish no, the Maastricht Treaty had fallen. It was as simple as that. But we were to learn that democracy is not something the Union takes for granted. The big countries, Germany and France, were not going to let popular resistance stop them. Instead, a rotten compromise was cobbled together, the so-called Edinburgh Compromise. It was designed to make the Danes back down. The Danes were granted 4 so-called opt-outs. It was in the area of justice, of defense, of the Union citizenship, and most importantly, of the euro. And then we were supposed to vote on the same text again. During this process, opposition to the EU in Denmark had become divided, and that was the main reason why they made their yes the second time. On the night the result of the referendum was announced, a violent street clashes broke out in Copenhagen between young activists and the police, and the police were shooting at the demonstrators. This sparked intense bitterness, and we will never forget. The Maastricht Treaty have effectively paved the way for the Union to begin interfering in social and labor markets. This may mark the start of a steady stream of directives which the Commission demands be transposed into national law. The Treaty of Amsterdam followed in 1998. It introduced an employment chapter which gives the Union the direct power by qualified majority to set guidelines for member states' employment policy. And the social protocol, which it is called, was written into the text of the treaty. Where do we stand today? Between 60 and 80% of all legislation passed through the Danish Parliament is in reality union legislation. This applies to virtually all areas: economy, environment, social and labor market policy, tax policy, public service, agriculture, fishery, industrial policy. Furthermore, the legislative process takes place in closed committees under the Commission, committees in which representatives from the business community often form the majority. In other words, there is no open democratic process. According to the official register, there are about 50,000 lobbyists working in the union every day. Direct union legislation may take the form of regulations from the Commission which apply immediately as law, or it may take the form of directives that must be passed by the Danish Parliament, but as a binding obligation. They must be implemented. Besides this, there is the legislation that Danish politicians themselves agree to and adopt in order to mask the union influence. But trade union leaders are also playing this game and are quietly incorporating union legislation instead of fighting against union directives related to labor market conditions, they are discreetly implemented in the text of collective agreements. We have seen this with the Working Time Directive in 95, which has now been incorporated into the majority of Danish collective agreements. The directive permits a working week of up to 48 hours for up to 10 weeks at a time. We can conclude that our national sovereignty today is a shadow of its former self. The consequences of this is that the national political process is increasingly losing any real substance. When all the major parties have accepted in advance that they can, in reality, only move every fifth piece of the chessboard, the national political debate becomes a monotonous mess. This breeds apathy with politics and is an extremely dangerous development in terms of the rise of the right-wing populists. And something about trade union struggle. We have seen how the Union Treaty allows the union legislation to encroach upon national social and labor market policy. But what is the political essence of this legislation? Who will it benefit? There is one thing you need to understand when it comes to the union. At the outset, in the beginning, they speak frankly about the matter. But as we get closer to the point where things are to be adopted, the language and the arguments are changing. It has to appear good for the people. The union cares about your welfare. We have seen many examples of this. But let's look at what Jacques Delors said in 1993. We have a great deal to thank Delors for because he spoke his mind. At the Union Summit in Copenhagen, Delors said, European businesses cannot compete with the welfare state weighting them down like a ball and chain. Jacques Delors was not a conservative businessman. He was a member of the Party of the European Socialists. In 1993, Delors also authored the so-called White Paper. Here he sets out three main objectives for the union's labor market policy. 1. Social transfer payments must be reduced. 2. Wages must be much more flexible. 3. Working hours must be made more flexible. In the paper, I have made some quotes which is documentation for what he says and what is said in this white paper. And I think they are good to have in documentation, but I will not read them here. But the intention is clear. The workforce is to be divided into an A and a B team. The A team consists of those who retain their jobs even in times of crisis, and for whom employers are therefore willing to provide social security and other welfare benefits that tie them to the company. The B team consists of the causal labor that can be brought in and out as required. Delors' point is that this labor should cost nothing more than the pure wage. In other words, the B team does not accrue sufficient pension, sickness insurance, and things like this. They must provide themselves through private savings schemes. When we look at those things from Delors' white paper and see where we are today, it is precisely these objectives the union has been pursuing ever since. Delors just said it openly. However, having said all this, there is also another important angle to the EU's attack on the Danish labor market model and the trade union. It is a fact that the union does not recognize that the labor market is regulated by collective agreements. It must be regulated by individual rights and by legislation either from directives from union or national legislation. This dispute began as early as the 90s, but it became to a heat in 2004 with the eastward enlargement of the union. This year was in many ways a watershed year. The floodgates were opened to an influx of labor from Eastern European countries virtually from day one. The rules of the single market dictate that Eastern European workers must be paid at their home country's wage level when working in Denmark. In fact, this is precisely the content of the proposed service directive put forward by the European Commission the same year. This proposal triggered an outcry within the trade union movements across member states. It was soon nicknamed the Frankenstein Directive because the commissioner was Falkenstein. Large trade union demonstration with up to 100,000 participants took place in Brussels. The draft directive was temporarily withdrawn, but 2 years later it was adopted in a light version, which essentially had the same problems. A combination of all these two factors led to social dumping skyrocketing in a short space of time. The trade union movement in the Nordic countries responds to this wage dumping with the usual well-known methods of industrial action in order to defend the wage level set out the collective agreement. But then the union shows its true color. In 2007, the European Court of Justice handed down its ruling in the so-called Laval case, also called the Vaxholm case. It said that the Swedish trade union movement has no right to use its traditional industrial actions against companies that underpay foreign workers if these workers are employed under the so-called Posted Workers Directive. This ruling was a shock to the trade union movement in Denmark, Sweden, and other countries. However, the so-called Laval ruling was followed by a series of other rulings which are not as well known. It is, for example, the Rüffert ruling. Here we are in Germany, in the state of Lower Saxony. The German federal states enjoy a fairly high degree of autonomy. A German company was to carry out construction work with a prison. The company negotiated an agreement with the state government. The state parliament of this state had passed legislation stipulating that work within the state's public sector must comply with the collective agreements in the relevant sectors. The collective agreement in Lower Saxony differs from the general German collective agreements in this sector in that, for example, that the minimum wage is higher. However, this German construction firm contracted a Polish firm to carry out the work, and soon it emerged, however, these Polish workers were only being paid 46% of the wage set out in the collective agreement. The German firm was taken to the German labor court and fined. Then subsequently, the firm went into liquidation. The liquidator, Dirk Rüffert, was dissatisfied with the German labor court's ruling, and the case was brought to the European Court of Justice. And in 2008, the European Court of Justice rules that the state of Lower Saxony requirements that companies working to the public sector must comply with the collective agreements was illegal under union law. And there was the Luxembourg judgment. This concerns an entire state which is not allowed to have a law requiring compliance with a collective agreement within the country. Luxembourg had decided that foreign contractors had to submit lists of their employees so that the state could carry out some checks. We also had it in Denmark. It is called the Root Register. The Court of Justice of the Union found that this law was incompatible with the union law. The court held that it was sufficient for the home country to exercise control over these employees. The requirement for personal data constituted barriers to the free competition. And in July 10, another surprising judgment, it was about pensions. This time the case was about pensions in Germany. German collective agreements stipulate that pension schemes must be managed by public institutions. The European Court of Justice declared this provision is illegal with the union law. The management of pension funds must be put out to private tender. Fundamentally, the Commission does not recognize that a labour market such as the Danish can be regulated through collective agreement. The Commission demands that directives must be adopted as parallel legislation on the side of the collective agreements. The argument is that trade unions in the Nordic countries do not cover all workers and do not ensure collective agreements for all workers. That's what we call the erga omnes principle. The only thing that can satisfy the European Court of Justice is that collective agreement is a law of the minimum wage. From the perspective of the union judges, the collective agreement system appears to be an obstacle to the freedom of establishment, which is one of the most sacrosanct principles of the union law. So in October 20, the union presented its first proposal for a directive on a statutory minimum wage. The Danish and the Swedish trade union movement in particular reacted strongly. The argument was that if an official minimum wage was set, it would trigger a race to the bottom, with wages gradually being driven down to that level through competition. We have seen such a development in Germany. The Danish government was not inclined to reject the proposed directive, although they were against it. However, we mobilized strongly within the trade unions, and we also received some assistance from some lawyers. Consequently, the government at last decided to bring the case before the Court of Justice of the European Union, arguing that the directive is unlawful because it interferes with pay conditions, and pay conditions are expressly extended in the Union Treaty. This happened in January 23. And last autumn, the ruling was handed down. Denmark lost the case. Surprise. We had expected that the Union Court of Justice always rules in favor of greater integration. This means that this minimum wage directive also applies in Denmark. But we were barely had time to lick our wounds before the next attack appears on the screen. The Union has now put forward a proposal to establish what is called the EU Inc. It's about European companies, which is a bump on the national legislation and labour market regulation. According to the plan, this is to be adopted by the end of this year. This legislation offers the possibility of completely opting out of the national rules of all 27 member states and choosing a completely different setup. And as the ETUC, it is the European Trade Union Confederation, puts it, they said, it is a fast track to social dumping. In Denmark, we are currently mobilizing against this legislation. We will meet for our first campaign event in a month in the middle of September at the port of Esbjerg. And I'll say something about the euro. Back to the referendums. In 2000, the Danes were once again called to the ballot box. the government wanted us to join the single currency, which had been introduced the year before. But once again, the Yes campaign has miscalculated. They did not believe that the Danish would bother to discuss such complex subjects as economic policy, exchange rates, interest rate policy, and all that. They thought they could win the day by arguing that it is so handy to have a single currency when you are going to holiday in the southern Europe. On the no side, we took this challenge and launched a broad joint overnight campaign, it is called in Denmark. Unfortunately, there was not just consensus within the major Yes parties. In particular, prominent Social Democrats disagreed with their party and actually argued for no. And in September, the Danes voted no to the euro by a solid majority at more than 53%. It was a huge victory, and since then, the Yes parties have not dared to raise this issue again. I want to say a small thing about what is wrong with this euro. Let us first consider what does it take to establish a single currency in a region. And here it makes no difference whether this euro is red or blue or black. It simply requires a homogeneous economic area where countries are not too far apart in terms of their states of development and which are at the same point in the economic business cycle. Why? Because a single currency locks in a whole range of policy levels that one would otherwise be able to adjust to balance the economy. The exchange rate is fixed, the interest rates are fixed, the fiscal policy is constrained by the convergence criteria in the EMU, and so on. So is this Eurozone then such an area? No, quite the opposite. There is a very significant difference between the economies of Germany and those of the countries such as Spain and Italy. And this equality has worsened with the establishment of a single market. The gap between rich regions and poor regions within the Union has widened significantly. That is why a number of prominent social democratic economists warned against the euro. They said, it can only succeed if there is a political union which through taxation and redistribution ensures a substantial income transfer from rich to poor regions. They therefore demanded that the euro should be put on hold until political union was a reality. But why did the union elite not listen to this advice? Simply because the euro is a political project. The single currency is intended to foster political union as a means of realizing the dream of a union superpower. So the euro has been a high-risk project from the outset, and it is in fact still a high-risk project. I think it is important to realize that. But what happens when the euro is started anyway? Who pays the price? The only remaining option for adjustment is what we call the internal devaluation. In other words, those countries that would previously have devalued their currency are now paying the price through falling wages, unemployment, poverty, and so on. Is this only theory or is it reality? What happened was that the euro exchange rate was driven by the strongest economy, namely Germany. This meant that those countries which were not as competitive and which in the past would have been able to value their currencies and thereby restore the balance, now had no levers to pull. The result was that goods from the southern Europe could not compete at all with the German goods. Over a 10-year period, Germany thus increased its export to the 4 Southern European countries, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy, by 240%. Here lies the direct cause of the Southern European countries' big public deficit. It is simply a lack of tax revenue and the rapidly rising unemployment benefits that are causing these countries' big budget deficits. So when the financial crisis hit in the autumn of 7, these countries were easy prey. This brings us to the next point. What sort of policy is the euro based on? The economic and monetary union is a very special thing. It is one of the only places in the world where the economic policy is put in the constitution. All politicals, regardless of their political views, are bound to pursue a neoliberal monetarist policy which prioritize low inflation above all other objectives, and it places ultimate control of the economy in the hands of the central bank, which is political independent. That is crazy. One of the clearest examples of this policy is the way the union reacted during and even more after the financial crisis. When the financial crisis broke out in 7, it posed an acute risk that the euro would collapse. The union's response was massive injections of money, the so-called bailouts, to save the euro and the major banks, particularly the German ones. The so-called Troika, which was the Commission, the ECB, and the IMF, traveled to all the heavily indebted countries and dictated a long list of economic measures in order for them to receive the bank rescue package. IMF wrote the following in their annual report. They said, the Greek bailout was intended to save the euro and some Northern European banks, but it was the ordinary Greeks who paid the price. That is straight talk from IMF. In Greece, the BNP fell by 11% over the first 3 years, and wages fell by 20 to 30%. In reality, this amounted to an enormous redistribution of wealth. Germany made a profit of 21.6 billion Danish kroner from the Greece debt crisis. This was partly through interest and loans, and partly through the profits from the so-called security market program, which formed part of the Greek debt program. Conversely, in 8, European taxpayers contributed a total approximately 10,000 billion Danish kroner towards guarantees and aid for the major European banks. But even more striking was how the union continued after the crisis itself, where most of the world gradually returned its economies to normal. From 10, the union began to stand out from a group of capitalist economies, including the USA. A significant shift in economic policy was implemented, moving towards systematic cuts in the public sector as a whole, in public spending in particular, cuts to social benefits, and cuts to wages and workers' rights. One might debate what is driving the union elite to impose this course of action. They stated aim is to promote the competitiveness of European business and maintain the confidence of the financial markets. It is likely that the ever-present fear of the euro's collapse is driven this development. The policy is being enforced through implementation of a series of political pacts. It is the European Pact, the Euro Plus Pact, the Six-Pack, and the Fiscal Compact. At no point the Commission is wavering. over the 10-year period from 8 to 18, more than 400 labor market reforms were implemented on the direct instruction from the European Commission. The model is the German Hartz reform. Increase downward pressure on wage and create more flexible wage setting, weaken the trade union side, and decentralize wage setting to the company level. The results of this policy are clear to see. Wages are falling significantly in most of the union countries. We are not just talking about the wage share, we are talking about the real wage. At the same time, the growth in new jobs is concentrated in what we call atypical work. 4 out of 5 new jobs are all this kind. It is part-time work, one-man and a horse firm, if you know what this is, and 0 hours contracts. This is what we know as the working poor. More than 1 in 10 workers in the EU is currently working poor. And the result is, of course, a dramatic rise in poverty. 20% of the Europeans, the same as 120 million people, today live in poverty. And that was the data from the 2018. The pact that has had the greatest impact on us in Denmark is the fiscal compact. The Danish government, led by the Social Democrats, signed the fiscal compact, even though this was not a requirement from the union. It is transposed into Danish policy from what is called the Budget Act. Budget Act has had very significant consequences for public collective welfare in Denmark. It is calculated that the shortfall in public welfare are provided by local authorities and regions over a 10-year period following the adoption of the Budget Act amounts to at least 25 billion Danish crowns. In 22, the rules of the fiscal compact were relaxed. This was a result of the war in Ukraine. Countries are now permitted to run larger public deficits. However, the condition is that they must be able to demonstrate that the money has been spent on military. This brings us to the final topic. How is the union responding to the new global situation? I will not say too much about the union's military because I imagine you already are somewhat familiar with this. The picture is, after all, quite simple. The union was very quick to use the war in Ukraine as a pretext to ramp up arms production at full speed. And with Trump in the White House, the union once again exploited the political window of opportunity to turn up the heat even further. In the spring of 25, a strategy paper was published by the Commission. It is called the Rearm Europe. It is a concentrated expression of how the union is being set on the path to militarism. The union is to help member states rebuild their armed forces. As a key part of the military union, there must also be a common market for arms. The arms industry is clearly the most important pillar of the military union. This paper has been followed up by a white paper, which is called Towards European Defence Capabilities in the 2030. It is said, individual countries must rearm themselves. Billions of euros are to be spent. Infrastructure must be made available to facilitate military mobility. Funds which are earmarked for expanding the rail network are to be used, amongst other things, to widen various tunnels and so they can be used for military transport. And military infrastructure must be extended all the way to Ukraine. The union elite would have preferred a new treaty to remove the right of veto, which still applies within the common foreign and security policy. However, they chose to work within the current treaty because they do not dare to risk to be blocked by a referendum in any country. The current treaty does in fact contain a number of loopholes that can be used to push through development even if there are no consensus amongst all union countries. The military rearmament is only one element of the union's new strategy, which is called the competitiveness compass. The other key element is to maximize the competitiveness of European monopolies by freeing them from all restrictive constraints. The model of this is USA, that is said openly. For these two purposes, 5% of the union's GDP, this is 800 billion euros a year, is earmarked until 2030. But can it really be true that 800 billion euros a year spent on weapons and industry will not come at the expense of public welfare? No, of course not. And this is also evident if you read the Draghi report carefully. The union will attempt to raise private capital. The Commission points out here that it is particularly important to build up large pension funds that can invest in arms. To ensure this, the Commission will press the member states to overhaul their pension systems. But enormous amounts of public capital will also be required. Here we should bear in mind that the Union were quick to exploit the coronavirus crisis to almost overnight to secure the accept from all countries for the first time in history to incur joint debt, which the countries are liable and which they must repay collectively. The Commission was given a mandate to raise loans on the financial market, and repayment is to take place between 28 and 58. And the cost of servicing the loans will be included in the budget, the union budget. And the Commission got straight to work. According to the Draghi report, payment of these common loans amount to 30 billion euros a year in 28, when they are beginning to pay it. Continued joint debt insurance plays a key role in the entire new military strategy. Thus, it is said a broader issuance of public debt may be necessary to make the financing of transition, that is what Draghi said. But what will be the cost to you and me? The Commission made no secret of the fact that such a process entails certain costs for all countries and their citizens. The investments shall be offset by budget savings elsewhere, and it is said, and Draghi continues, that common debt on a more systematic base would require a stronger set of fiscal rules to ensure that an increase in common debt is matched by a more sustainable trend in the national debt. It is not difficult to see what this means. So there can be no doubt that the cost of this strategy will be high and rather risky for the ordinary citizens of the European countries. Some would argue that we must pay the price and take the risk because we have to save ourselves from Trump. As I see it, the problem is simply that the Union is no counterpart to the USA. The Union is a loyal partner to the USA on the global stage. If we look at how the EU responded to the war in Ukraine, they were following the US instructions with complete loyalty, not only in terms of the military build-up, but also regarding the sanction policy. This shows that the Union has no plan to break free from the USA or to choose a different course. They are good fellows. At the Nordic Council meeting in Stockholm in October 25, Ursula von der Leyen made an interesting speech. She began, as usual, by declaring that Russia is the greatest threat to the European Union. She said, "Not far from here, Russian fighter jets have violated European airspace. From Oslo to Copenhagen, drones have flown over critical infrastructure. And in the Baltic Sea, undersea cables have been cut. The intention is clear, to divide us, to split us." And she continued, "Russia is preparing for a protracted confrontation with Europe, and Europe must have the capacity to deter any future Russian aggression." So hang on, what was this? The Nord Stream cables in the Baltic Sea turned out not to have been cut by the Russians, but by the Ukrainians. And the drones over the Copenhagen airport, well, there was no evidence at all about that. The airport control tower, which had been monitoring the area all night, had no drones on their cameras. But as we all know, the truth is the first offer of the war. But what does von der Leyen say about Greenland? She says, "And as the ice retreats, the Arctic is moving ever closer to the center of the global geopolitics. Earlier this month, for the first time ever, a Chinese container ship reached Europe by cutting through the Arctic. Russia is reopening the Soviet-era bases and asserting control over the Northern Sea route. So it is Russia and China who are the enemy we can see. Von der Leyen is following the US narrative to the letter. It is a fact that the only superpower which have been aggressive and direct in its demand to take control of the Arctic, including Greenland, is the USA. Yet not a single word from von der Leyen about this, about Trump and his demand to control Greenland. European monopolies, of course, have their own interests, which the Union carefully safeguards. Von der Leyen comes very close to the truth when she concludes her speech with the following. Global warming brings new and dangerous risks to the Arctic, but it also brings new responsibilities and new opportunities. Take the critical raw materials. Greenland alone possesses 25 of the 34 critical materials that Europe needs. That is a treasure hidden beneath ice and rock. And she says, make no mistake, the Arctic economic strength is the key to the European strategic independence. So you are probably wondering what Iceland has that the European monopolies need. My guess is that you have cheap energy in large quantities. This is absolutely crucial for building the data centers that will be needed if the Union are to develop their artificial intelligence. But that is just my opinion. I fully understand the concern that many Icelanders have regarding the current global situation. It is extremely dangerous for all of us because the world is being whipped up into a state of war. But I do not believe that the Union is a solution for you. And above all, you must realize the enormous political cost it will entail for you if you say yes to this Union. That is what I have tried to explain here, the political costs based on the experience we Danes have had. Thank you for the word.
Yeah, everyone, thank you, Karen, for a very informative talk. And I want to open the floor to questions or comments from anybody interested. I wanted to start a quick comment, if perhaps you could elaborate on. We hear the argument a lot that to have a better say about our future, we need to be at the table, have a seat at the table. And it struck me through listening to your talk that a lot of the things that states in Germany or small countries like Denmark want to do in their own affairs, they seem pretty powerless against the European Union, the European Court, etc., and the institutions. If you could elaborate on that, why wouldn't we want a seat at the table?
We sit at the table, and you can see how it is, how it has been for us. We are a little bit bigger than the Icelands, and we cannot do anything. Small countries cannot do anything in the Union. It is the German and the French, and sometimes they cooperate the Italy or other, but it is those two countries who decide about what is and what they decide about is what monopolize wants. And you are not going to do anything. And when they can promise you something because they want Iceland to be a member of the Union, but you have to know maybe it will work in 1 year or 2 years, but it will not work ever because there are not any ups out in the Union. You have to take it all. So it has been a very dramatic development in Denmark after we have been a member of the Union, and we cannot do anything. You can see, yeah.
Thank you, Karen. August.
Hello, my name is August. Thank you for your speech. It was really. You told us what the European Union is. Love the whole nation here. Listen to this. That's just so much. Important for me to write everything down in English. But,
You do not. You can take it.
Yeah, but yeah, I want to ask you one question.
Yeah.
I was recently reading an article by Icelandic historian Árni Daniel Júlíusson. Many of us know has been active.
Fellow socialist.
He lived in Copenhagen at the time of the violent protest following Denmark's 1993 referendum, the Edinburgh Agreement. His account made me reflect on how deeply opposition to European integration was once rooted in parts of Danish left. For much of the European left, opposition to the EU was not based on nationalism or isolationism. It was based on a critique of European integration taking place within a capitalist framework, one centered on the free movement of capital and market, and seen as limiting democratic control over economic policy, workers' rights, and the welfare state. That tradition has not disappeared entirely. Organizations such as NHS and Folkebevægelsen mod EU
People's movements. Yeah.
have continued to criticize aspects of European integration from the left, particularly when it comes to democracy, labor rights, and the Danish welfare and labor market order. But the political landscape has clearly changed since the battles for Maastricht in the early 90s. Euroscepticism is now more commonly associated with the national right. While much of the European left has become more accepting of or even strongly committed to further European integration. I ask because something similar has happened in Iceland. The Icelandic left seems to have fallen asleep at the wheel on the issue, though the Icelandic Social Party has recently changed that way. Somehow, much of the left has gradually moved closer to the EU, while some of the most right-wing political forces have moved in the opposition direction and become increasingly Eurosceptic. As a result, the critique of European integration that was once strongly associated with left, based on capitalism, democratic sovereignty, workers' rights and control over economic policy, risks being surrendered to the political right. So I'm curious, has the same thing happened in Denmark? Where does the Danish left stand today in European integration? How strong is the old left-wing critique of an EU built around capitalist market integration, and is there still a significant political force in Denmark that sees opposition to further EU integration as a project of the left rather than something that belongs to the national right?
Yes. May I answer? Yeah. Both yes or no. Because what you tell about what is happening in the Iceland is in some way also happening in Denmark. You know, we have a party called Enhedslisten. This party was a part of the people's movement against the union, have been working there together with me and other people for many, many years. And then they found out that they would not continue to be a no party. And today they support that you are a member of the European Union. So we have this, but this development is not as strong in Denmark as it is in some other countries. And I think it is because we have had this people's movement, which is a broad political movement from the middle and the left. We do not have the real right wing within this movement, but we have all normally people, if you could say that. I think that it is the movement against the union in Denmark is not a right-wing movement. Most of it is still for the labor rights, for the welfare state and all that. That is still what drives the movement. But I think it is very important that we cannot decide what we should say about the union to look to other political movements and say, oh, if they are saying yes, if they are saying no, then I will I will say yes. You cannot do that. I think that some of the left wing, they are being scared because the right wing populist movements are campaigning against the union. They are not against the union. They are populists about this. They are not really against the union, but they are becoming scared. And then we cannot be against the union. But you cannot do that. If you do that, then you give the whole scene to the right wing. The left wing has to fight for our for what we mean about the union. And if you do not do that, then you are sure that the right wing will win. If you look at the UK, most of the left wing, they stopped campaigning against the union. And the right wing, they took it all. And they led the Brexit in the UK. And that was not nice to see. I have wanted that it was the left wing who had been campaigning against. They could have done it, but they did not. So it is so important that we are fighting for this. Yeah.
Thank you. Jon, perfect.
Yeah. So my name is Jon Levy, though I prefer to just go by Jodak. I would like to first of all compliment you for your quite fantastic speech about the Danish experience within the European Union. My question will be rather simple about very basic worries and economic exploitation. I have heard rumors as of recent that I do not personally believe are true, but I have heard rumors that the European Union has hinted at a willingness to discuss the problem in regards to the common fishery policy, because that is one of the main worries for a lot of Icelandic commoners. And I was wondering, in a situation, as an expert on the subject, in a situation where the European Union would legitimately come to the table and decide to compromise on the common fishery policy, do you believe that they would dare respect it in long term as they would promise in this hypothetical? Or do you believe that they would eventually break that deal in favor of their own economic benefit and exploitation?
It's not so easy to say so much about it, but I think they will not respect it in the long time. In the long, of course, they have to make a deal about fishery. Or I think that the Iceland, they would never go to the Union. They would say, fuck you, if they are going to destroy your fishery, of course. So they have to do an agreement about something. But I'm sure that they are not going to respect it in a long time. Because, I think the only example you have of countries who have the opt-out of something, that is Denmark and Sweden. We are not members of the euro. Strong forces want us to go to the euro. And many times politicians says, now we are going to have this referendum, we are going to join the euro. But then they just look at what says the
Opinion polls.
Opinion polls, and they says that there is a no in the Danish people. They will not have this euro. So they go, okay, we have to see this. That's the only opt-outs you have. No other countries have, and it is said there will never be a country again who are allowed to have such an opt-out again. So I don't think so, but I can guarantee you. But look, I know you had a discussion. Oh, we are going to negotiate. We are going to see how much can we get. But if you do that, I would say you are naive. The union is not for children. They are extremely aggressive, and they are quite clever when it comes to this. And when they have got you on the lime stick, or what is called
The hook, yeah.
Yeah, then fine, we forget. You just have to go in, and then the doors close. Yeah.
You have quick?
Yes. Hi, thank you for coming. I only have a very short question. I recall you said something to the effect of 60 to 80% of legislation that passes through the Danish parliament is European.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could elaborate. Is that legislation being brought from the European Parliament, or what makes it European? Those 60 to 80%. That's my question.
Yeah. It is not coming from the European Parliament, because the European Parliament does have very much influence in the Union. The only one who can make legislation is the Commission, and it is not democratic in any way. They are the only which can make legislation, and it is coming from the Commission, and it can be in Danish it is called forordning. That is legislation that is it is in work at day one. The Danish Parliament are not going to do anything about it. It is just law in Denmark from day one. And then there is what we call directives. They shall through the national parliaments, but they cannot say we do not want this directive. They have to implement it. I think that you can say that you do not want it. As you have this stop possibility. We do not have it. We shall implement these things, and they are implemented in Denmark. So this is the main, but there are also other ways of legislation which indirectly influence in Danish. There is in Denmark there is a big debate about how much of the legislation is from the union, because of course the people who support the union are not very happy about this 80%. It's not so good for them. So of course we discussed. Yeah.
Erna?
Yes, my name is Erna Bjarnadóttir. I have been hanging around this No to EU movement for, I think I can say decades now. Thank you so much for your hugely informative talk. And I hope the Socialist Party will have it arranged to be translated to Icelandic, because there's so much information in it. Apart from the information you gave, I was also delighted to hear you address that even if the conservatives say no, people here should not leave that as a reason to say yes, because we're in this all together, and you described it very well when it came to the labor market. My question is, if these people are calling up our countrymen on the phone, asking if they have made up their mind, what would you tell them to say on the phone to an uncertain person? Why to say no on 29th?
In short,
So, like, yeah, what would be your most persuasive argument to say to an undecided voter right now? You have to call them up on the phone. Why you should say no?
Okay. I think I can hear from your discussions that the most important thing is the euro. Some people from Iceland think that the euro will be the home for you and your economy. Nothing could be more dangerous. I have tried to explain what it means when you go to the euro. The euro is neoliberal. It is German policy. You cannot change that. I understand that you have a much different economy here. You would be forced to change your economy to this policy. And I am 100% sure that will be unemployment, that will be poor people, lower wages, all the way. You have to decide if you really want that. And are you then going to be safe? I have tried to tell you that the euro is a very risky project, and it still is, because now they make a lot of common debt, and it is rising very fast, and every country in the union have to pay this common debt. And you cannot stop this, because that's the way they finance their military. So are you ready to pay the military with your taxes? I only ask. I think that would be some of the most important things to say to people. Yeah.
Kalle?
Thank you, Karen, very much. I might point out that Áfram Ísland, which is like fighting for no, they have a call center ongoing, which is open from like 10 to the night every day, I think, until the election. So we should go there and call, especially as left-wingers, socialists, we might have a special thing to the voters. But Karen, thank you so much. This is excellent. I have two questions. One about the labor issues, because we have a very settled labor market here in Iceland with strong laws and pretty strong unions, but structurally they're very strong, but they're not politically. They're very weak, very ineffectual, very passive, and I don't think most of them are considering this at all. Like what the effect will be of us entering into the EU. They're not thinking about that. I wonder if you would elaborate a little bit what you might warn us about what we would be facing, and then also because a lot of people here in Iceland say, like, we must go into the EU to join the other socialists in the EU to fight for socialism within the EU, something like that. Fight for social justice within the EU. But I think that's pretty hopeless. I've heard from socialists from all over the EU. It's a very, very tough situation. So I think, how do you see the EU changing? As a socialist or a communist, what is the path forward realistically? How could change happen in the EU for the member countries in the EU as a whole? Thank you.
Yeah. To take the last thing first, I do not think that we can change the EU because there is a constitution, there is a treaty who has said what is the policy here in this union. We are not going to change it. We cannot change it. So you cannot make a red union. I don't think it is possible at all. And if you are trying, you lose your forces. But of course, we have to cooperate with all movements inside, and we think that we have to cooperate with labor trade unions and labor movements in other countries very much against all those things which the union brings to us. And just now it is what I call the EU Inc. That they are making this legislation about the European companies that can work all over the union without any respect for the legislation in the national countries. I think that is the worst thing we are working against now, and there are growing movement in all countries, also in Denmark. So yeah, it's not so surprising that you said that some of the trade unions in Iceland, they do not say anything. They are very late now. It's because there are very much pressure on them. We know that from Denmark too. Many of the trade union leaders in Denmark, they do not say so much because they have links to the Social Democrat Party and they are told you dare to say anything. So we have to make the campaign with concrete things. When we make a campaign against the minimum wage directive, we can make those social democrat trade union leaders active because they have to be against it. And they are active and they are honest. So you have to do it in concrete. Then you can work it, make it work. And I think that's probably the same you have to do in Iceland. I wanted to say that I was the daily leader of the overnight campaign in Denmark, and I was working every day with people from the Conservative Party and some of the other, what do you call that, national parties. Yeah. And I believe that most of them are honest people. They really want to make this known. And if they are honest, you can work with them, and it's not a problem. We had a very, very, very fine cooperation in this. We have to gather our forces if we are going to win. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. I'm about to conclude. I want to offer Harald Olsson to make a short announcement, but before I'll give him the mic, just to simply say, to me, as a socialist, there is no stronger socialist cause than to be against the EU. It's a neoliberal capitalist machine composed of lobbyists and bureaucracy. It's about to militarize itself on a scale never seen before. Why would a socialist be for it? That being said, all socialists are welcome in the Socialist Party, but please, I would like people to take this lesson away out into society. It is actually a very strong socialist cause, and do not let people frighten you into thinking otherwise because what? We agree with Miðflokkurinn or Sjálfstæðisflokkurinn, be against the EU because they are actually principled on this issue. They are, in these sense, fullveldissinnar. Okay, and we're pro-sovereignty. This is an issue that is not based on party affiliation. And then we, on top of that, have our own socialist left-wing reasons to oppose the EU, and we can be proud of those. So, thank you very much. Not of achievement to come here on a very, very sunny day, in a very, very building and sit through this lecture, as informative as it was. Thank you all for coming. Please have coffee and some snacks, and we can continue to chat. But before we start that, Haraldur Björnsson.
Takk fyrir. Við langar til þess að biðja ykkur góðfúslega að hjálpa okkur við að dreifa þessu bæklingum. Það mikið eftir. Þeir við sem hefur verið að minna ekkur á höfuðborgarsvæðinu, ekki síst í Störfólum. Þeir sem að dreifsta sig til þess að ekki hundarblóð komið á talið hérna í takkinu eftir. Svo mega menn gjarnan taka þátt í umræðinu hervæðingu það eru margir sem að munu láta samfærast af þessum rökum að Evrópusambandið að verða hernaðarbandalag. Það væri fínt ef þið deilduð greinum þetta og ef það verið skrifuð og þið bara fara heim og deila greinum og skrifa það. Takk fyrir.
Ekki bara deila greinum, spella á það og haldist herra í
Spella á þar, læka, kommenta, deila, það skiptir máli, við erum í kosningaherferð, ok? Takk hérlega fyrir komuna og spjöllum áfram á fórum okkur kaffi. Þú fyrir mig að Júlíus, ég bara tengt tölu, það var margar hendur á lofti. Við kannski bara spjöllum saman hérna í andirinu.